All right, everyone, without further ado, I'll pass it off to Kelly.
All right. Well, thank you, Danielle, for inviting me. When she issued the invitation, I said, well, I'm going to be back in October. Do you want me to come and do it in person? So here I am.
Excuse me, can you give us a background on who you are first? So we know.
Yeah, I'm just me. My name's Kelly Weaton. I started doing genealogy about 50 years ago when I married my husband. I'm a California girl, and he was born in Pennsylvania, and we moved back to his hometown, which was 3,000 miles away from mine. And it was a small town with not much to do, and I picked up a Family Circle magazine article on how to trace your family tree. And since his family had lived in the town for 3 or 4 generations, that's how I cut my teeth, going up to the Progenitors office and looking through old records when I was 17 years old.
Huh.
And so I've seen it from microfilm, when you would go to an archive and scroll through microfilm without the benefit of a index. And you were just looking for a particular name, and then you would go home from a day of doing that, and you couldn't fall asleep at night because the microfilm was still going through your brain. And then DNA-wise, it started in, what is this, 2011, 10 years ago. I got frustrated after 40 years of trying to figure out whether my husband was a Weaton or a Weaton. I didn't know if he was a descendant of Robert Weaton of Rehoboth or if Thomas Weaton of Branford, Connecticut. And Thomas Weaton's descendants changed the spelling of their name to Weaton. So it all gets mixed up. If you've ever seen a Weaton Van Lines, the moving company, that's Weaton. Will Weaton, the actor, he's a Weaton. So anyway, I didn't know. And there was no paper trail way for me to figure it out. So for Valentine's Day, I gave my husband a DNA kit. And it took about 5.5 weeks. And I got my answer. He was a descendant of Robert Weaton. So that's how I got started. Then with the autosomal DNA, which I did. I can do YDNA. I did it at Family Tree DNA, but also at 23andMe. And then I got really active on the forums there, we were all trying to help each other in the beginning, figure out how this worked. And as someone said earlier, the DNA is changing so fast, and there's so many, I mean, it started out, a YDNA kit was a 12 marker kit. Now, if you do a big Y, it's 500 markers. That's just in the Y stirs. We'll get to it in a minute. Anyway, that's kind of my background. I married a Weaton. And I'm a Weaton. I'm a descendant of Hannah Weaton. I have 20 Rehoboth families. I have more ancestors in Rehoboth and Swansea area than any place else. So that's why Rehoboth. Anyway, that was something I wrote. And I do think there is something, and I don't think it's necessarily mystical. I think there's probably a, all matter is conserved. And we have atoms and cells in our body that were once rocks or birds or ancestors or whatever. So I think there's a pull to certain places, or like I was describing, being in a place and the feel of it is right. People tend to move to areas that are similar to places they came from. See that in my own home in the Napa Valley. We have a lot of Italians and different families that came and settled in a similar area and end up doing the same sort of thing. So I think there's something real there. So the Rehoboth DNA project was the first ever town-specific project. I think there may be one other one now. There are mostly by state, by county, by country, but not town-specific. And like I said, we began in 2011. And when I made this slide, there were 480 members. I think there's been a few new ones as of late. So that's quite an accomplishment. And the idea when I set up the project was to see if people with ancestors in Rehoboth would still share autosomal DNA after 250 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started doing it, and we had a small pool of people, it took a while, but as the pool grew, at least 2/3 to 3/4 of people matched somebody else in the group, which isn't really surprising, especially if you have more recent Rehoboth ancestry. But a byproduct was the YDNA. It became a place where we're collecting the YDNA of all these male progenitors. And because the YDNA doesn't change, it's actually quite powerful. The mitochondrial DNA, which is the mother's line, would be powerful too, but it's a lot harder to follow because at each generation, the surname changes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my favorite slide. And as I was going over it earlier, oops. Click on the right one. The little zeros, the O's, that's the mitochondrial DNA. So this line is following your mother's line. And both men and women inherit their mitochondrial DNA from their mothers. So everybody in this room got your mitochondrial DNA from your mother, and that is a way to search back that line. There are fewer locations on mitochondrial DNA. It's fairly limited number compared to the locations on the Y. So it's not as powerful. You could have a perfect match on mitochondrial DNA, and the ancestor you have in common is back 2,500 years. So it's not really all that helpful for genealogy purposes, except there are areas where it could be. Let's say you thought that your grandmother and your great-grandmother going on that matrilineal line was Native American. You could prove that with the mitochondrial DNA. So there are uses for it, but of the 3 types of DNA, it's the least useful. It's the one I don't recommend unless you have a really good reason for it. So people who test it, you don't often get much of a result from it. So the YDNA is my favorite, and that's because it passes down intact. You can see there's no color combinations in there at all. It's just the thing. And that's why you can go back thousands of years, because if we look at a proverbial Adam and his YDNA, the changes help us plot out where humans went. And we used to only look at the ancient part of it. With Snips now we can look relatively recently and go all the way back. And we'll see that in a minute.
Kelly, can I interrupt for just
Sure.
a moment? The people at home can't see the slides well. I'm
Okay.
going to see if turning on the lights interrupts your view. So let me know, because I think it'll help balance the light for the people over Zoom.
Go ahead.
Can you all still see that well?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that should make it better for people at home, hopefully. Thank you.
This slide is on my website too.
Okay.
So in the autosomal DNA, you can see up at the top, they gave a different color. And this is just for one chromosome. We're assuming this is like one chromosome. So you have a pair, you get one from your mom and one from your dad. And so you see that this child got a blue from his father, and this kind of gold, yellowy green color from the mother. And then when it gets down here, another generation, it gets bits and pieces that are coming from this set of, this is the father and this is the mother. So it's what I call slice and dice or mix master. This is autosomal DNA, and so you're getting little bits and pieces of all these different ancestors. That's why it doesn't go back very far. With the autosomal DNA, you can't go back 300 or 400 years. with certainty the way you can with YDNA. Does that make any sense to you? I see that you don't.
What? No, I have a reasonable amount of experience with DNA. I was puzzled about how you were using autosomal DNA for private,
Yeah,
but I see you're not.
Well, you can and you can't. The thing is if you have two fourth cousins that share a common ancestor, after the fourth cousins, the amount, only like 5% will share DNA as we get fifth, sixth, seventh cousins. So it doesn't mean that you don't have DNA from the same set of ancestors. It just means you've got different bits and pieces. And in order to get a match, you have to get the same bit. Yes.
I know you tried to about mitochondrial DNA, but how far can you go back on that? Can you go way back on the?
Yes, you can go. It's because it goes intact. It has very few changes.
It makes it harder.
That makes it harder because, you know, my mother's maiden name was Lundberg and her mother's was Sheldon and hers was Hall and
but
hers.
you know that.
You can.
Okay, it's as good as Y, but it's just harder.
It's, yes, it's much harder. It's sort of like patronyms, you know, with, it makes it harder to follow.
But you can go back further.
Yes, but it doesn't, the thing with mitochondrial DNA is it doesn't have very many overall markers, as many addresses on the mitochondrial DNA. So, and it doesn't go through as many changes. So you could have a relative in common, but it might be back 1,700 years. And that's not really helpful for most people for genealogy purposes.
There are less markers than with Y?
Lots less.
Why?
Lots. Mm-hmm. So, what is unique about the Y chromosome? It's strictly patrilineal, passing from father to son, and it passes largely intact. It doesn't go through recombination. The only parts of there's little teeny bits on the ends of the Y chromosome that have a little bit of recombination, but we don't worry about that. The major part of the Y chromosome just gets passed on with very few changes. And here's recombination. This is going to be hard to see even for you in the audience, but this shows mom in orange and dad in red, and it shows how different. The changes actually happen not at conception, they happen when the egg and the sperm are developing. And that's where all the slicing and dicing and all the potential for all these differences happens. And then with the fertilization, then the two come together and you get a new person. Well, the Y just goes down without any changes whatsoever. Just gets passed from father to son to son to son forever, and that's why I love it.
What does mutate?
Yes, but the mutations are few and far between. We'll get into that in a minute. It mutates, but not much. Okay. A lot of these slides are meant to answer questions that I got from you in terms of questions that people had. So why do the progenitors matter? They matter because if we can establish who the progenitor is, we can help lots of people who don't know where they came from. They are a carpenter from Ohio and they think they might trace back to the Rehoboth carpenters, but they don't know. Well, if they do a YDNA test, we can tell them whether they connect with our carpenters or not. So the project has become very helpful in terms of people that don't have a good paper trail. Those of you that do have a good paper trail and you test, then we know, okay, that's that particular line and we can make the connection. So what I have here, let's say you're Pennsylvania Bullock line and you don't know where you connect, a YDNA can connect you with our Rehoboth Bullock, but we have more than one Bullock line in the project. One is what I believe to be is the Rehoboth bullock line, and then there's another one. And whether that is a separate bullock origin in England or an NPE, non-paternal event sideways, I can't tell you that.
Kelly, can I ask a probably very basic question? Is a YDNA test different than a DNA test you would take from one of these kits that you can buy online? Is it a special type of DNA test?
Yes, the kit that you awarded, the MyHeritage kit.
Yeah.
MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, Ancestry, Living DNA, and 23andMe. They're all testing autosomal DNA. And it's really wonderful now. I mean, you can make connections, but they're in the first 5 or 6 generations, typically well.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, it gets hard to connect a little segment of matching DNA with a particular ancestor, because we may have multiple ancestors that we connect on, and we can't necessarily say that's Bullock and this is Weaton and this is Walker. So it becomes a dicier proposition. But all of those are testing autosomal DNA. YDNA is different. And it used to be the Ancestry tested YDNA, but they gave that up like 8 years ago. So the pretty much only place in town to get your YDNA tested is Family Tree DNA.
Okay.
They pretty much have the market. Why do a YDNA test? To prove that you are who you think you are. There's also the reason not to take a DNA test. I do not recommend anybody take a DNA test unless you're open to finding out the truth. If you don't want to know the truth, don't take a DNA test. The DNA test does not care whether you have a tree back to, you know, the King of England and it's all perfect and wonderful. It doesn't care. It has no agenda. It's just going to report what's there. There's lots of things that you can find out. Some of them are rather uncomfortable. So if you don't want to take a DNA test, don't. In some cases, you can find out your origins in Europe with the Snips that we're going to get into in a minute. It's getting more and more possible to find out very detailed origins about where you come from with the YDNA. So that's why I really like it. And like my example earlier, you may want to take it just to help others, because DNA is pretty much a collective effort. Like genealogy, it's to be shared. If you're a genealogy hoarder and that's not good. We all share in ancestors. We need to share information. Okay, this is the part where your eyes are going to kind of go cross. So there's Y-STRS and Y-SNPs. The Y-STRS are the single tandem repeats. When you take a YDNA test and you see it's a Y37 or a Y111 or Y67, it's giving you Y-STRS. Y-SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. I have to look at it. I can sometimes remember. You don't need to know that. You can just call them Y-STRS and Y-SNPs. It's like driving a car. You know how to drive a car, but you don't know all the parts or how they work. That's one of the things you need to learn about the whole DNA thing. Just learn what you need in order to be able to use it. You don't have to know all the details. The Y-STRS get you in the ballpark. That means if you take a Y37 test and it comes back and you get some matches and you have those little figures that you're going to see in a minute, that's going to tell you whether you're in the right grouping, the right surname grouping. The Y-SNPs can get you even finer and closer. For instance, with Robert Weaton, we can have Y-SNPs that determine different branches of the tree. This one might be from Ephraim, this one might be from Benjamin, another one from John. So the more data that we have on those Y DNA tests from the SNPs, the more we can actually create a family tree which is DNA based. And this is almost impossible to see, but this is how you log into the website. I could show you another, but let me just kind of go over this briefly. At the beginning is the kit number in this first column here. Then is what you'll see is the surname of the kit. And if you've entered it, it'll have the paternal ancestor's name, which is the farthest back that you know. And the more detail you have there, the more helpful it is to me. This is the haplogroup. This one up at the top says A, I can't read that, M32. Is that okay? And then these are E's, G's, and so forth. And then these up along the top are the STR markers names. This one says DYS 393, I think. And then the numbers, this jumble that you see that you're thinking doesn't mean anything. That 21 at that marker simply means that there's 21 repeats of a series of DNA. That's all that is. And so if there's on the Y STRs, between a father and son, they can add a repeat or lose one. So let's say your father had a 15, and in that process of the germ cells that become the sperm cell, there's a drop off or an increase, that's that number. And they can switch back and forth. They don't do it often, but they do it often enough to be irritating, such that one could switch a couple this way and then switch back and look like another one. So it's not determinative. They've got some squishiness in them, so to speak. So in some ways, they'll get you in the project and into the right grouping. For instance, oops, I have a terrible time with this. Did I go all the way to there? We go. I have Bowens up there, and you can see there's just a few little differences. There's a grouping of 13s at that particular marker, and then the rest of them have 14. Sometimes a grouping like that will indicate a branch of a family. So a particular son or grandson or great-grandson of Bowen's has that 13 there. But then it can switch, and it could go back. So these aren't determinative. That's what makes them irritating. Question we had, what is genetic distance? Blue is a loss of a repeat, red is an addition on these charts. There's blue and red. And it's the number between two people. So between this two Bowens here, there's 5 differences. If we go across, there's 5 differences. So that's what genetic distance is. It'll say -5 GD, that's the genetic difference, or -1. When you get your match list, it'll show 0 differences, 1 difference, 2, and that's the way. But even that isn't dependable. Sometimes it means you're more closely related to somebody that you have very little difference, but it's no guarantee because of that sort of squishiness that I told you about, because of that annoying habit of going back and forth. This is from FTDNA. You can find it in their information center, and it gives you a relative idea of how closely a match is based on the number of differences. So across the top, this is 12 marker, 25 marker, 37, 67, and 111. So at 111, even with 6 to 7 differences, it's saying they're properly related. But at 12, 1 is it's saying it's probably related. But that really depends on the haplotype it is. I wouldn't stick with that too close. So YDNA matches. When you get a match list, again, I'm sorry about these slides. They just don't show up very well here. This tells the genetic distance in this column. It's telling the name of the individual. I've blocked that out. And then the tests that they did, whether they did a 111, in this case, big Y. Then over here, this is the earliest known ancestor, and it says the haplogroup and terminal SNP. Even if you haven't done a big Y test, you can find out what your likely haplogroup or terminal SNP is by looking at your match list. I know this isn't making sense, but it
Right.
will. Okay. You can also run a tip, YDNA tip. It's a little icon in your results, and it calculates what the odds are to a common ancestor. So at 4 generations, there's a 23.9% chance of a common ancestor within that 100-year approximate period with a 67 test. This is 2 different Weatons I'm comparing, and it's showing the probability. So you can see by the time we get up here to 16 in the past 400 years, it's giving a 98% chance of. But I can tell you, because the Weaton markers are so weird, they are astronomically weird. You know what I mean? You'll have some markers that are very common, and they're off the charts. So if anybody matches them, I know that they're related to the Weatons because there isn't anybody that isn't. They're that weird. That doesn't happen very often. It's sort of like on the bell curve, you know, but you're going to have people at the tail, people in the middle. There are people in the middle that if you have common markers, you might have to go out to a Y67 test in order to get valid matches because there's so many people with those same group of markers. What is a SNP? A SNP is a mutation that happens once. It happens once, period, in the history of humankind. So what that means is if I have a guy here, let's say it's Robert Weaton, and there's a mutation that happened between his father and him. Every single one of his patrilineal Weaton surname males is going to have that mutation. No one else is going to have it. I could test somebody just based on that one SNP test, which costs about $23. If they're positive, I know they're a descendant of Robert Weaton. The thing about SNPs is they're definitive. They don't switch back and forth. They happen once. And so you go along and you have Robert and you have that SNP. And so, okay, let's say you have Robert Weaton SNP. You go down, and he had 8 sons. I think 7 of them had children. One of the other ones died out. So there's 6 lines coming down. Somewhere along the line, there's going to be another SNP, and that's going to identify maybe Robert's son, John's son, Benjamin. If you have that SNP and you're positive for that SNP, that means you're a descendant of not only the Robert, but that Benjamin. It's definitive. We can prove which line you're on based on that SNP test. That's how wonderful it is.
So I have a question. How often do these SNPs occur? Like once every 10 generations or?
We used to think that they happened every couple hundred years. We realize now that it might be every couple generations. So that might be, if you do a big Y test, if you test the whole Y chromosome, you're going to find one in a few generations. So they're happening closer to now time, which is allowing us to chart out that tree.
And are they hard to find? Is it like needle in a haystack, you just come upon it, or can you search for them?
If you do a big Y test, it reports out all the SNPs.
Okay, cool.
If you don't want to spend the kind of money, you know, that's a few $100s to do a big Y test, and you think that you're a descendant of a particular ancestor that I have identified as SNP on, you can do a $23 SNP test and prove it one way or the other. So the work that other people do, if the people that afford to do like a big Y test, they help everybody else who comes along afterwards. So what is a SNP? It's simply, if you think of the Y chromosome as a street, and you have addresses on the street, 2317256, that's an address. The proverbial Adam, the first man, had a T at that particular address. A SNP is where there's a mutation and that T became, say, a C. There's only 4 bases. So it's just a change that happened. But that allows us to identify where that person came from based on that. That's why it's so powerful. I mean, it's basically, man, you were walking around with an encyclopedia of the history of your family and you didn't even know it. It's that definitive. Here is a migration map from proverbial Adam. This is Africa. It's not showing somehow on this slide. This is Africa. It goes up into the Middle East section and then over into Europe. It's just not showing that here. And this is just for haplogroup R. Other ones take very wild paths out into Asia. This is from Mike Sager, and this is a graphic of the different haplogroups. And you can see that the biggest part of that is what? Which one do you see? R? Mm-hmm. R1b and R1a. And then the others, so there's a few of you here that are G's. I is a pretty big grouping. So in England, the biggest haplogroups are R and I. There's a little bit of G. E is actually an interesting one. Most of the E's in England, I believe, came from Roman slave ancestry. So they're coming out of the Middle East, probably as slaves and probably being carried in during the Roman occupation of England. Any questions about that? Have I completely lost you? Kind of a little bit. So this is what's happened since we started. In 2002, you were talking about how many SNPs and how hard they are to find. There were 243 Y SNPs that separated up the whole Y tree into these different haplogroups and then these little branches. Now, I imagine this is close to 400,000 now, SNPs. And that's with the advent of the next generation sequencing, you know, the progress in the ability to extract the DNA and get these Y SNPs and get them at a reasonable cost. So, and that's probably gonna, I mean, that doubled in 2 years, probably gonna double again a couple of times. How useful is Y haplogroup? 2 men in different haplogroups, I'm talking the A, B, C, D, R, I, are not related in any meaningful time frame. So if your Brooks line is a R1b line and his Brooks line is an E line, they are not related. They are not the same. So it's probably the fastest sifting of the results is into these broad haplogroups. Haplogroup Q is Asian or Native American, and we have a few surnames in the haplogroup Q. I don't know whether they're Native American or whether they come through an Asian angle, but they're a little bit more unusual.
Are those considered in the same haplogroup then?
What?
Asian and Native American?
Yes, they are, because if you think of the land bridge, that Asian,
Right,
that's
right.
how
Okay.
yes, how it got here. But it could also be Asian that came into Europe in a different way, and you'd have to get down into the sticks of it a little bit further.
Well, because if you've done your DNA test and it says you're 3% Asian and there's nobody that you can find in your backstory that does, then maybe it could be Native American instead.
It is most likely Native American if you have no other good explanation. Yes. I've covered most of this already. A through D, haplogroup A to D have more recent origins in Africa. There is an E that comes out of Africa that is a little bit further back. I don't know if we have any. So even if you have the same surname and you are in different haplogroups, you cannot be related in a genealogical time frame. Question?
Question in terms of searching, like I'm on 23andMe, so take that. But you can filter and search in different ways, you know, by surnames or by.
Yes.
How come if this is so important? Unless I'm missing it, I guess it's kind of what I'm asking.
No, I think you're fine.
You can't
It's
filter
one
by a haplogroup, can you?
at 23andMe. If you yes, you can. If you're a male, you can search through a Y or a mitochondrial haplogroup.
Where is it?
I don't know, but we can look at it at the end and see if I can find that. You should be able to search by haplogroup. And for men, if you test with 23andMe, even though it doesn't give the specificity of some of the family tree DNA, you can get fairly down the road on haplogroup at 23andMe for men. Yes?
I don't know if it's a good time or not to throw this question out, but I have noticed that I have numerous relatives, females, that have both X and Y.
One of two things strikes me. Either they're female testing a male relative. You're not going to get YDNA from a female, or they've entered the YDNA of their father as their line. You shouldn't.
I don't know. I've read up. I'm not positive.
Well, if women have two X's and men have an X and a Y, so there isn't. I mean, unless you.
There are people that have X.
Yes, there's a
and
few
Y.
people that have two X's and a Y.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
Females?
females that have two X's and a Y.
okay, yeah.
That's
Correct.
possible.
Correct. Two X's and a Y.
Not likely though that you would be running across a lot of those on 23andMe.
I just started searching in the spring.
Okay.
I've got easily over 10 to 15.
Yeah, we could look at them if you want to do that afterwards. We can have a
I'm
look.
wondering like how that.
I think they probably have family members. My profile has my Y and mitochondrial haplogroups on it on 23andMe, and that's because I got my brother tested.
Exactly.
And I entered on the site that he's my brother. So the site shows his Y haplogroup for me,
Yes,
but I haven't got it.
exactly. That's my guess is what you're seeing.
Going on.
Okay, all haplogroup R1b, different surnames, unrelated. This is just to point out that I have these grouped in the project, and these are all R1b. You can see that they have different values. Some of them, you know, you have this stack of them that all have 10 at that particular marker, but they are a mishmash over here. And then this row here shows the terminal SNP or the haplogroup. The R is the haplogroup, and then there's a hyphen, and there's the name of the SNP that they've been tested to. If it's in red, it is an estimate. If it's in green, these mean that this person has either done a big Y or one of the other panel tests that give you specificity in terms of the marker. These do not have to match identical for these people to be in the same group. In this case, this is a mishmash, so that's not the same. This is all haplogroup Q, and again, we've got different surnames listed. I've got Fuller, Garfield, and Smith here. Now remember, when you're looking at the names in the Rehoboth project, some of them are going to be the early Rehoboth families, and some of them are going to be men who have a maternal line that goes back to Rehoboth or a circuitous route. And so we have lots of different surnames that are not necessarily what we think of as Rehoboth surnames. And I don't filter them out. They're all, everybody's welcome.
But you can only be part of this group if you have a Y line going back to the original project.
Yes, I mean, for these groupings, you have to have a Y. You either, and if you're a woman, you've got to have a surrogate. You know, you've got to have a father, a brother, an uncle, or whatever to give you your Y line on that. I mean, this is the largest grouping we have is carpenters, and you can see that they all match each other pretty well. There's just a couple of off modals, but you've got this big group here, and they're all identical. So we can be pretty sure, unless William Carpenter his wife was busy somewhere else, that this is William Carpenter's line.
But even if you have 10 generations back, if one of them's a female, you get sunk at that level, because it goes somewhere else.
Yes, it would go somewhere else. And then these ones are carpenters that aren't related, and you can see that they don't match up. The modal is 13, 25, 16, 10, 11, 14, and these go all wonkers on this, so they don't match. It seems like just a little teeny difference, but if I take one of these that's not related and I put it up here, it'll get all these pink and blue showing that it doesn't match. So sometimes there's different ways for me to match them. One is to click on one of these and see if it's a match to them. Another is to just take one of these and put it up here and see what happens.
So what are you saying about those people down there? They're not from William Carpenter?
They're not from William Carpenter. And they may, I mean, they may be Rehoboth lines, and there was an adoption that nobody knew about, or something happened and they don't match up. Or these could be people that joined the project because they thought they might be related to Rehoboth. This one has entered John Carpenter, Hog Island, Virginia, US in the 1700s. So maybe he thought, well, maybe he's going to match up to the Rehoboth Carpenters, and he doesn't.
And you don't do anything with the William Carpenter of Providence?
No, that line is right here. I think this Cockerham is William Carpenter of the Providence line, is right there. So
He's supposed to be a cousin.
Yeah, William's cousin. So.
He's not.
They were supposed to be cousins, the two William Carpenters.
Yeah, but
Stars, they're not?
No, because this one is this one's R1A up here. These are all R1A, and this is R1B. So no.
Interesting. That was A number of years ago, I was looking at a carpenter project that I think Brown did to compare the William Carpenter Rehoboth line to the William Carpenter Providence line, and are you familiar with that?
No, I mean, it's possible, but I'm looking there, at least that the Cockerham is M198. I'd have to look it up, but I think that's under M269, which it would be, actually that one is, wait a minute. This one could be related. This one's an M198, which could go up here, and we could try doing that and see what happens. But these other ones here can't be. So that is the Providence line, and that's possible. So I take that back. We can look at that to make sure. There's a Sheldon project that I also do, and there was 5 Sheldon progenitors that came to the United States, so 5 different lines. And when I started helping with the project, we were able to take those 5 lines and put them into 2. We don't know, there's a John Sheldon of Providence, and there's a John Sheldon of South Kingston, or Narragansett, and they are not related. One traces back to Derbyshire in England, and the other we don't know where he traces. But there's an Isaac Sheldon over in Connecticut, and he matches perfectly with the John of South Kingston. So we were able to put those together, and then the 3 others we were able to put together, so into 2 different clusters. So that's the other powerful part of the YDNA, where you can take different lines that may have come at different times to the United States, and we can figure out whether they're related or not. Why you might want to do a big Y test. You're interested in the origins of your surname. You want to trace back to your ancient ancestry. You're trying to determine which son was the progenitor of your branch, or you want to participate more deeply in the surname project. The big Y tests all the Y strs on the Y chromosome, as well as those Y SNPs that I was telling you about, those determinative SNPs. So big Y tests include about 700 Y strs, whereas the maximum usually I recommend is the 67 test. There's a 111. I don't usually recommend that unless you have a very good reason, or if you're using it as a stepping stone to buy a big Y. There's 23 million base pairs or SNPs. And I can't remember exactly, but on the mitochondrial DNA, it might be, 1.5 million off the top of my head. It's quite a bit smaller. And when you do a big Y test, almost always there's going to be 1 or 2 private SNPs that are going to be just for your little branch, probably in the last couple hundred years. So you get a SNP named for you, maybe. This one, this is the Sheldon. You're not going to be able to see it from here, unfortunately. Oops, very well. But this is a line. It goes over here, and this is, say, Isaac, and this is the John. These 2 guys are related, which we didn't know. And then the line goes down, and we have SNPs that identify the different branches. So that's where it starts getting quite helpful when you're trying to build a tree, especially in the absence of other information.
Where are the Sheldons from? They're not from Rehoboth.
No, my Sheldons are from South Kingston, Rhode Island.
Did you come across Sheldons from Canada?
I know of Sheldons in Canada, yes.
I'll talk to you after.
Yeah, and so many of our Rehoboth, Sheldon, whoever it is, you've got the influx of English coming later into Canada or into the United States to fight against us.
Yeah.
in the revolution, and then you have the loyalists who fled and went up to Canada, you know, when things didn't work out their way. Anyway, I have, I'm here to answer your questions and get you back to where you can understand. And I can also, we set that before where I can look at, if you've tested, we can look at your actual YDNA if you have specific questions to help you. But I'm still seeing that look of, God, I don't know what she's talking about. So what can I do to make it better?
Not necessarily DNA, but my grandmother was a Weaton. And I know she had brothers, quite a few brothers. Is there a way on your site to find out if any of their descendants took the test? Do people leave their names?
Yes, I have the names. So if you give me the names, I can tell you. Most of I don't have very many recent testers in the Weaton project, and I would love to get more or to find relatives to test, because if I could get more big Y tests, then I could figure out which son my husband is descended from. So
I know my line, but this would maybe prove it.
do you know which son?
Well,
which of
Robert,
Ephraim?
Ephraim.
Oh,
Robert,
and Ephraim, yes, that would be interesting.
Andrew, Senior Andrew, Junior, Lucas, Warren, Joseph.
I think I can get you close on the site in terms of that line. I know
Okay.
there's.
I mean, I've got it.
Yeah, you're
documented,
probably fine.
But you know, am I 100% positive? No, you know, I've got documents, but that doesn't necessarily mean.
Well, that's true. Until
Right.
you do the DNA, you don't know whether it matches up. I mean, I was kind of scared at first that some of the things that I thought, and in the beginning, talking about the Sheldon line, on the autosomal DNA, I wasn't getting any matches on the autosomal with Sheldon's, and I thought, oh my God, maybe I'm not really that Sheldon. Maybe there's something not so good there. But when I looked at it, that going back, they only had 2 or 3 children per generation. So there's fewer people to test. So it takes a lot longer for you to find somebody that matches up, that you still retain the same bit of DNA. So sometimes it can look shaky and it turns out okay. And then I found a skeleton in my closet when I did my DNA. I ended up with 0.6% African. And
well, there's another thing. So 3rd generation in Robert, in his will, he leaves his wife, his Negro servant, Rose. And I was going to ask you if you found any African.
there are African, but I don't know of any in New England, but there is a branch. One of our testers, his family went south, and there are, I think there might even be a Weaton football player who's African. And I have family in the South as well. And all I can figure is somewhere along the line, I have an African ancestress who probably at some point passed. And there you are. But I had no clue. And it was after I got my DNA test, I was talking to my aunt. I said something to her. And she said, well, you know, there were all these rumors about your grandmother. And it is on my grandmother's line. I mean, I know where it is, but the only matches I've been able to get are European like myself. So I haven't got an African-American match on those 2 segments. So I don't know what the answer is yet. And I have to admit, it's somewhat uncomfortable when I go back in the records and find the ancestors who enslaved people. It's not very comfortable feeling. But I did have something good happen in that in one of them I found 3 generations of enslaved people named. So the grandmother, the daughter, and her children by name. And there's places, I think it's called Beyond Kin. And there's a way to put it on your ancestry tree so that somebody might be able to find it someday, so that you would be helping out an African family that's looking to figure out where they connect. Because really it's the European, it's people like me that probably are the key for them to find out where they come from. So anyway, that was my surprise when I did. And at first I got it back and it's such a small amount and I didn't know, and I wrote to a couple people, because a lot of people would say to me, oh yeah, well everybody has African, that's like, thousands of years ago. And I said, yeah, but it looks like these big chunky segments. What does this mean? And it meant exactly what I thought it did. So, I mean, if it's scatter bits, if it's little teeny tiny pieces, that could be way far back. But when it's organized segments, that's a real person that could be, like a fourth great grandmother.
Have you found any Ormsby family in Rehoboth?
I don't have Ormsby, and I don't know if we have any in the project.
Would it be on there on your website?
Yes, they would be in there. And the way to get to it is just FTDNA Rehoboth, and then look at the DNA results, and you can see.
Yeah. If the lines go back to Europe, my mother's line goes back to Europe, but my father's goes back to Ireland. Did they do the similar kind of studies over there?
Well, yes. I mean, through FTDNA, there's Ireland projects, there's surname projects, there's everything under the sun. My son-in-law is a Riley, was always very proud of his Riley Irish heritage, but it turns out that his line is a Norman line to Ireland, but he's okay.
They pillaged the village. They all did.
Well, they did. This is in Galway, and I mean, and there's all these different surnames, and they have like 113 castles. This particular family. It's just, humans have been messing things up forever. It's just, anyway.
Well, everybody has.
But he does have Rileys from County Cavan, like he thought, but that's because he had multiple Riley lines in his family tree.
But you can do it and then get information. So if I get my brother to do the Y line.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, one of my four brothers to do the Y line.
Yeah, figure out who's the most likely. You don't need to do more than one unless you suspect that there was some sideways activity, and then, you might get in trouble if you start testing.
Doesn't have a cell phone, but that's the back part.
Right.
And, ancestry tells me I have a brother. Yeah, I know it.
Right.
Any other questions?
Well, if your family, most of your family lines that take you back into Rehoboth are women,
yeah, it's really good.
Are we stuck?
Yes and no, because, mine is Hannah Weaton.
Me too.
And so, but I look at all the male lines and look at where they come from and the different things, and so it's interesting in that way. But following it up, my mitochondrial DNA line doesn't go back to Rehoboth. It goes back to New Jersey, where all genealogies go to die. I told you that earlier. It's my brick wall ancestors. I have in 1790s. I mean, they should be able to be found, and one of them is my mitochondrial DNA ancestor, Margaret Geary. I don't know if that Geary is German, if it's Irish, if it's English. I don't know. The mitochondrial DNA did not tell me that. And I'm stuck there, and I don't have any perfect matches.
The other thing I love in Europe is what has changed. So what was Germany, was France, and then Germany. So Hawaii, Germany, French, doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter. Oh, and the other thing I didn't even mention, all the, everybody takes the autosomal DNA test because they want to know what percentage of Irish and what percentage of Scottish and everything. Those things constantly are changing. And they're looking at a subset of the markers that you have that are geographically related. I have let's see, I have a grandfather that's 100% Scandinavian. He's 3/4 Swedish and 1/4 Norwegian. The rest of my tree doesn't have any Scandinavian in it. And I'm talking, unless it's that Geary, it's not there. And I'm coming up with way too much, almost 50% in the latest iteration of Ancestry, Scandinavian. And it's impossible.
Well, Northern Europe,
Yeah,
Northern
come on.
England, I mean.
Exactly, and that's where I think it's coming from, because I have a bunch of Yorkshire and Scottish and whatever, and so I think it's reflecting.
The Scottish and Ireland, they just keep changing my numbers, but bottom line is there isn't much difference between Ireland and Scotland.
If it's Northern Ireland and Scotland, they've been going back and forth for millennium.
And then it probably goes back to the Normans or the Vikings or somebody that
Yes.
came and killed the village.
The YDNA line gives you a little bit of an indication based on the haplogroups as you get down. It's like RU106, that tends to be more Germanic.
Yeah.
There's ones that are more Celtic. There's ones that are more Viking. So you can get a little bit of that parsing, but it's only on that one line. Your tree is made up of so many.
Have you seen the new Celtic test they did in Ireland? A group went in with permission on the west coast of Ireland to a school and tested all the children because there's a running joke about, when you find out where the Celts are from, let me know. Nobody.
Well,
They
I have a surefire way to tell you whether you have.
They did DNA tests on all of them. Not one had Celtic DNA. Not one.
Well, the Weaton DNA actually is Celtic in origin. My theory about the Celts, whether you go to Ireland or Scotland or Wales, the reason that England was able to take over those countries was because the Celtics are they're clannish people. Family is everything. Country doesn't mean a damn. And so when it came to fighting against the English or whatever, they were too busy fighting amongst themselves in their own clans, in Wales, in Scotland, in Ireland. Always the same way. So it's divide and conquer as far as the English are concerned. Come over and do their thing.
They were just surprised that they didn't find anybody with Celtic.
Yeah. And this was where in Ireland?
Yeah.
It was on the west coast. I could find it for you if I look at it. I'll send it to you. They were doing it basically combined with the study of the Orkney Islands, where they say everything is from the Norwegians or Celtic, and apparently it isn't. Now would they test that water and everything?
But again, like on a YDNA, it only gets a hold of one line, and if it's the autosomal DNA, it's got so mixed up by the time it gets there. It's really hard for them to make those kind of.
This wasn't a fun group. These were documented genealogists that we did.
I haven't seen it, but I would love to read that. And so how many in here have taken a YDNA test, sir?
Just one.
Probably our male relatives.
Yeah, okay. Well, any of the rest of you, the YDNA, the Y-star markers, they used to call them junk DNA because they didn't think they had any reason. Because remember I told you there's so many repeats?
Yeah.
It's just a little series of, CT, GG, CT. And then it got repeated 22 times. That's it. They thought it didn't make any sense. They didn't think it had any reason. Now they've discovered, we know that nothing in nature has no reason, right? It always has a reason.
Yeah.
Well, what they've discovered now is it has something to do with switching on and off other DNA cells, activating them. But it's not very identifying in other ways.
Is that the same as a paternity test?
Yeah, except they use far fewer markers
To do it, but it's similar. It's just this shortened scale.
Yes.
A woman can't take a Y test.
No. Now you have
No.
to find a male relative.
I said this earlier. I don't want to embarrass you, but you know the old Freudian joke about envy? I have Y envy.
Yeah, of course.
because it's so powerful. That's why I like it. And it's easy. It's relatively easy to use. Although nowadays with Ancestry has over 20 million people in their database. So it's incredible, you know, what you can do and the connections you can make and what you can find out. Let's say you didn't know where in Sweden you had an ancestor. You get, you know, 15 matches from a particular area, and now all of a sudden you have a place to go looking for your family. Yes? No? Question?
We went to research one of my relatives in Scotland, and we met her and stuff. But they all looked at my husband and thought that he was the person who was from their family. It was funny, yeah.
Does he have any Scottish?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before you go,
we've always wondered if we're both related to each other, you know.
well, my husband and I are related.
They fight everybody. They fight each other. So maybe they fought somebody to look like them.
I said, I think the young son said that he looked like his uncle, you know. So.
I found that in Scotland was probably the most hospitable place I've ever been to in the entire universe.
Lovely.
I was at a restaurant and I had some postcards, and I asked my waitress, where do I mail these postcards? Because you know, they don't have pickup there. You have to find a post box. And she starts to explain to me, well, you go out, you go down the street, go across the Royal Mile, go down, and then in between this and that. She goes, oh, here, just give them to me. She runs out, runs down the street, puts them in the box, and comes back and waits on us. That is incredible. And and everybody over there, if they find out you have any Scottish ancestry, you know, you're just part of the clan.
Yeah.
I imagine Ireland's similar, but I haven't been there.
Yeah,
Is it?
It is.
Same sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful places.
Yep,
People are
it makes
just
you feel
lovely.
right
They
at
don't have- Anywhere you go into, they want to chat with you. They
Yep.
want to, you know.
Yeah, where are you from? Do they
have
have
to see them.
relatives in common in America? Yeah, yeah. Actually, Germany was surprisingly hospitable as well. And a lot of Germans were holidaying in Scotland. And I was trying to figure that out. And then I realized in my own family tree for like 5 generations, I have German men all marrying Scottish women. So there's something there.
Well, you know what that is.
Anyway.
Well, thank you
I hope
so
I
much,
haven't
Kelly.
drive you crazy with that. The next time you try to do something with DNA, you'll get it better than you did before. I guarantee you that part.